Woody Allen was bombing on stage at the Blue Angel nightclub when he made the decision that changed cinema forever. The audience was silent, hostile, and walking out. That humiliating night in 1965 convinced him to abandon stand-up comedy and become a filmmaker instead. But before we dive into this story, if you enjoy untold moments from cinema history, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. It was December 15th, 1965. A bitterly cold Tuesday night in Manhattan's Upper East Side, with snow beginning to fall on the already slippery streets. The Blue Angel nightclub on East 55th Street was one of New York's most prestigious entertainment venues, a sophisticated establishment where careers were routinely made or permanently destroyed in the span of a single 15-minute comedy set. The club attracted Manhattan's cultural elite, wealthy socialites, influential critics, entertainment industry executives, and intellectuals who expected wit, sophistication, and polished performance from their evening entertainment. That particular night, Woody Allen walked slowly onto the small, intimate stage carrying his usual worn notebook filled with carefully crafted comedic material, meticulously handwritten observations about modern urban life that had made him increasingly famous throughout Greenwich Village's comedy circuit. But something was fundamentally different about his demeanor and energy. The audience of approximately 100 sophisticated patrons could immediately sense his unusual anxiety and fear before he even reached the microphone or spoke his first word. He'd been performing stand-up comedy professionally for nearly 8 years by this point, gradually building a reputation as one of New York's most intelligent and neurotic comedic voices. His material was intellectual, self-deprecating, and psychologically complex in ways that distinguished him from other comedians working the Manhattan club circuit. He analyzed modern anxieties, urban alienation, and middle-class neuroses with surgical precision and devastating honesty. But professional success had paradoxically made him increasingly anxious and self-doubting rather than confident and secure. Every performance felt like a comprehensive psychological test he was inevitably bound to fail. Every laugh from audiences felt unearned and fraudulent. Every moment of silence felt like public exposure of his fundamental inadequacy as both performer and human being. This particular evening's set was a complete disaster from the very first carefully planned joke. Woody opened with his signature neurotic observations about contemporary urban life, the precisely crafted material that had consistently made him famous and respected in Greenwich Village's most demanding comedy clubs. His opening bit involved detailed analysis of modern dating anxieties, delivered with the intellectual self-awareness that had become his trademark comedic voice. But his delivery was completely off from the beginning. His characteristic timing, the carefully developed rhythm that made his complex jokes function properly, was missing entirely. His voice lacked confidence and authority. Instead of projecting the intellectual superiority and neurotic charm that audiences expected, he sounded exactly like what he feared he actually was. A desperate, profoundly insecure man desperately trying to convince a roomful of strangers that he possessed genuine comedic talent. The audience, consisting primarily of sophisticated Manhattan socialites, entertainment industry professionals, and cultural critics expecting polished, intelligent entertainment, grew visibly restless within the first few minutes of his performance. Quiet conversations started at back tables. Drink orders increased in frequency. People began checking their expensive watches, then glancing toward their coats, then looking calculatingly toward the club's exits. Woody could physically feel every pair of eyes in the room judging his performance, every moment of silence condemning his comedic abilities, every subtle sign of audience disinterest destroying his confidence. The intellectual superiority and cultural sophistication that usually protected him from criticism and rejection crumbled under the immediate weight of real-time audience disapproval. He wasn't just failing as a professional comedian. He was being publicly revealed as an artistic fraud who had somehow managed to convince the New York entertainment industry that he possessed genuine talent and cultural significance. 10 minutes into what was supposed to be a 15-minute set, people actually started leaving the club, not quietly or discreetly, attempting to minimize disruption, but obviously and deliberately, making their displeasure and boredom completely clear to everyone present. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Conversations resumed at normal conversational volume. Coats were retrieved from the check room. The collective message was unmistakable. This performance wasn't worth their time, attention, or money. Woody desperately tried to recover his composure and audience engagement by switching abruptly to completely different material, then attempting improvisation, then making awkward, self-deprecating attempts at direct audience interaction. Nothing worked effectively. Each failed strategy made the situation more uncomfortable for everyone involved. The few people who remained seated were either too socially polite to leave or too fascinated by the spectacle of public professional failure to miss its inevitable conclusion. By the end of his allotted 15-minute performance slot, maybe 20 people remained scattered throughout a room that had started the evening with nearly 100 sophisticated, expectant patrons. The final applause was perfunctory, socially obligatory, and psychologically painful for everyone who witnessed it. Woody left the stage knowing with absolute certainty that he'd experienced something much more devastating than simply a bad night or off performance. He confronted the fundamental limitations of his abilities as a live performer and been found catastrophically inadequate. In his tiny dressing room afterward, staring at his own reflection in a cracked mirror surrounded by burnt-out light bulbs and peeling theatrical makeup, Woody made a life-changing decision that would alter both his personal trajectory and cinema history. He was completely, permanently done with stand-up comedy. Not temporarily while he improved his material or developed greater stage confidence. Not until he could better manage his performance anxiety or write more commercially appealing jokes. Done forever, irreversibly, and absolutely. He would never again voluntarily put himself in any position where his worth as an artist could be evaluated and potentially rejected in real time by strangers whose approval he desperately needed, but psychologically couldn't handle receiving or losing. But he wouldn't abandon entertainment or creative expression entirely. He would find a completely different artistic medium where he could control every possible variable, where he could perfect his creative performance through multiple takes and endless revision, where audiences couldn't reject him personally because they would never meet or interact with him directly. He would become a filmmaker, creating art in complete emotional safety while maintaining the intellectual sophistication and neurotic insight that had made his comedy distinctive. This wasn't organic artistic evolution or natural career progression based on expanding creative interests. This was purely psychological survival disguised as ambitious career transition. The decision to abandon stand-up comedy for filmmaking wasn't motivated by passionate love for cinema, burning desire to tell visual stories, or comprehensive artistic vision. It was driven entirely by terror of continued live performance and psychological need to create meaningful art while maintaining complete emotional safety and control. Woody had discovered through painful experience that his neuroses, which provided excellent source material for comedy, made him psychologically unsuited for the emotional vulnerability and real-time judgment that live entertainment demanded. Stand-up comedy required complete emotional nakedness and psychological exposure. Every single joke was a personal risk. Every pause between words was a potential moment of devastating public rejection. Every audience represented a jury of strangers who could find him guilty of not being funny, interesting, intelligent, or worthy of their attention and respect. The entire medium demanded exactly the kind of psychological vulnerability and emotional exposure that Woody's anxious, self-protective personality simply couldn't tolerate or sustain. Filmmaking offered what seemed like a perfect psychological solution to these creative and emotional problems. He could write comedic material in complete privacy, refine it through multiple drafts and endless revision, and control absolutely every aspect of its final presentation to audiences. Viewers would respond to his creative work without him being physically present to witness their immediate reactions, criticism, or rejection. He could create sophisticated comedy and meaningful art without subjecting himself to the psychological trauma and emotional devastation that live performance inevitably created. The path to that devastating December night at the Blue Angel had actually begun years earlier, during Woody's initial struggles to establish himself in Manhattan's competitive comedy circuit. Born Alan Stewart Konigsberg in 1935 in working-class Brooklyn, he discovered comedy as both creative outlet and psychological defense mechanism while still a teenager. His early material was heavily influenced by sophisticated urban comedians like Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce, who had revolutionized stand-up by introducing intellectual content and social commentary. But where Saul and Bruce possessed natural confidence and aggressive stage presence, Woody was fundamentally introverted, anxious, and psychologically fragile. By 1957, he was writing comedy material for television while developing his own stand-up persona in small Greenwich Village clubs. His breakthrough came at the Duplex, a tiny basement venue on Christopher Street where he performed for audiences of maybe 30 people. The intimate setting provided the perfect environment for his neurotic, self-analytical comedy style to develop. His signature routine involved detailed analysis of his own psychological inadequacies, delivered with such precise self-awareness that audiences laughed at universal recognition rather than personal mockery. He would dissect his anxiety about dating, his fear of death, his relationship with his parents, and his general sense of intellectual superiority combined with social incompetence. "I'm not afraid to die" became one of his most famous lines. "I just don't want to be there when it happens." The joke perfectly captured his neurotic worldview, acknowledging mortality while expressing the desire to avoid confronting it. This became his entire comedic template: intellectual awareness coupled with emotional avoidance. The material worked brilliantly in small village clubs where audiences appreciated sophisticated humor and psychological insight. But as his reputation grew and he began performing in larger, more commercial venues, the intimate confessions became increasingly problematic with mainstream entertainment seekers. The Blue Angel represented the apex of New York's nightclub circuit, where major entertainment industry figures discovered talent and careers were either launched or destroyed. Getting a regular booking, there was the crucial stepping stone to national recognition, television appearances, and recording contracts. Woody had performed successfully at the Blue Angel several times throughout 1964 and early 65. But each performance became increasingly difficult as pressure for national success intensified his natural anxiety. The sophisticated audiences expected polished professionalism, not tentative neurotic confessions. By December 1965, the psychological pressure had become overwhelming. Woody wanted recognition, but feared that recognition would reveal his inadequacy. This fundamental contradiction created a psychological trap that made authentic performance increasingly impossible. The specific material he planned that December night included his most developed routines about urban anxiety, intellectual pretension, and relationship failure. One piece involved his psychoanalyst. "My analyst told me I have a preoccupation with death. I told him it's the only thing I can think about. He said that'll be $50. Another explored his complicated relationship with Jewish identity and cultural assimilation. Growing up as Alan Konigsberg in Brooklyn, he'd experienced anti-Semitism while feeling disconnected from traditional Jewish culture. His comedy examined this cultural limbo with brutal honesty. But during that December performance, none of his carefully crafted material landed effectively. The timing that made these complex jokes function was absent. The confidence required to deliver neurotic confessions as entertainment rather than genuine plea for help was missing. Instead of appearing charmingly self-aware, he seemed desperately insecure. The audience's reaction wasn't just indifference. It was active rejection of his entire comedic premise. They weren't laughing because his neuroses no longer seemed funny or insightful. They seemed pathological and uncomfortable. The psychological distance required for successful comedy had collapsed. Entertainment industry professionals in attendance included talent agents, television producers, and club owners considering Woody for larger opportunities. Their presence increased pressure while documenting his failure for the broader New York entertainment community. Word of the disaster spread quickly through Manhattan's comedy community. Other comedians heard about the mass walkout within days. Club owners learned that Woody Allen had bombed catastrophically. The professional damage extended far beyond a single performance. It represented comprehensive rejection by the industry he'd been attempting to join. The psychological impact was more devastating than professional consequences. For years, Woody had defined himself primarily as a comedian. His entire sense of identity and self-worth was constructed around his ability to make people laugh and transform neuroses into valuable entertainment. The Blue Angel performance revealed this fundamental identity was unstable and potentially false. If he wasn't a successful comedian, if his material wasn't actually funny, if his neuroses weren't charming but genuinely off-putting, then who was he? This wasn't just career setback. It was comprehensive psychological devastation requiring complete reconstruction of his artistic identity. The decision to abandon stand-up wasn't made immediately. For several weeks afterward, Woody attempted to continue performing, hoping the disaster had been an aberration. But subsequent performances confirmed his confidence had been permanently damaged. Audiences could sense his fear and uncertainty. The transition to filmmaking began as psychological necessity rather than artistic vision. Woody needed to find a way to continue creating meaningful work while protecting himself from emotional vulnerability that live performance demanded. Cinema offered complete control over variables that had proven unmanageable in live entertainment. But the psychological patterns established during his comedy career would profoundly influence his approach to filmmaking. The same need for control that made live performance unbearable would drive him to maintain unprecedented creative autonomy in film production. The same anxiety about audience rejection would motivate his systematic avoidance of premieres, industry events, and direct feedback about his work. Most significantly, the neurotic self-analysis that had provided material for his stand-up comedy would become the central theme of his cinematic work. Films like Annie Hall, Manhattan, and Hannah and Her Sisters would essentially be extended versions of his comedy routines, detailed explorations of urban anxiety, relationship dysfunction, and intellectual pretension delivered through narrative cinema rather than direct address. The traumatic end of his comedy career would also establish patterns of emotional avoidance that would characterize his personal relationships for decades. Having learned that emotional vulnerability could lead to devastating public rejection, he would develop sophisticated methods for maintaining psychological distance while appearing to offer intimacy and connection. The Blue Angel performance that destroyed his confidence as a live performer would ultimately create the psychological conditions necessary for him to become one of cinema's most important and influential artists. The personal failure that felt like comprehensive defeat would prove to be the essential catalyst for artistic achievement that exceeded anything he could have accomplished as a stand-up comedian. But the deep psychological patterns that had originally driven him away from stand-up comedy would follow him into filmmaking. The same anxiety about audience rejection that made live performance unbearable would manifest as obsessive control over every aspect of film production. The same fear of inadequacy that created panic attacks before comedy shows would drive him to make one film per year for 50 years, constantly proving his worth through prolific output. The neuroses that provided material for his comedy also shaped his approach to cinema. His films would consistently explore themes of anxiety, inadequacy, and fear of being exposed as fraudulent. The characters he created were variations on his own personality. Neurotic intellectuals convinced their success was undeserved and that exposure of their inadequacies was inevitable. This psychological foundation would make him one of cinema's most distinctive voices while limiting his emotional range as an artist. Woody created a filmmaking career that protected him from psychological risks of live performance while repeatedly exploring the same themes that had driven him away from stand-up. The Blue Angel performance that ended his comedy career became the origin story of one of cinema's most prolific directors. The humiliation that convinced him he wasn't suitable for live entertainment transformed him into one of the most celebrated filmmakers in history. The psychological weakness that made him abandon comedy became the creative foundation for an unprecedented cinematic career. Looking back, that disastrous December night appears pivotal not just for Woody's career, but for cinema history. If he'd succeeded as a comedian, if the audience had applauded, if his confidence had been reinforced rather than destroyed, he might never have transitioned to filmmaking. Annie Hall, Manhattan, and dozens of other influential films might never have existed. The failure that felt like personal catastrophe was actually the moment when one of cinema's most important artists discovered his true medium. The psychological trauma that ended his comedy career became the emotional foundation for his filmmaking career. The audience that rejected him inadvertently created circumstances that would lead to some of cinema's most celebrated works. Today, Woody Allen is remembered as one of the most important directors in film history, not as a failed comedian. The transition that began with that humiliating night produced a body of work that influenced generations of filmmakers and redefined what comedy could accomplish as art. The fear that drove him away from stand-up became the driving force behind one of cinema's most distinctive voices. The psychological vulnerability that made live performance unbearable became the emotional authenticity that made his films resonate worldwide. The weakness that ended one career created the foundation for another that would last more than 50 years. But the pattern established that night, using art as psychological protection rather than emotional expression, would define both Woody's creative achievements and personal limitations for the rest of his life. He learned he could be brilliant while avoiding psychological risks that genuine intimacy requires. This lesson would shape not only his filmmaking but his approach to relationships, success, and human connection for decades to come. Woody's first successful film, Take the Money and Run in 1969, proved that his neurotic voice could translate effectively to cinema. The documentary-style comedy about an incompetent criminal was essentially his stand-up persona transformed into narrative filmmaking. Critics praised his innovative approach, and audiences responded positively without Woody having to witness their reactions in real time. This validation encouraged him to continue developing his cinematic voice through a series of increasingly sophisticated comedies throughout the 1970s. Sleeper, Love and Death, and eventually Annie Hall demonstrated his growing mastery of film as an artistic medium while maintaining the psychological safety that live performance had never provided. The irony was profound. The man who couldn't handle immediate audience feedback became obsessed with controlling every aspect of how audiences experienced his work. He developed an unprecedented level of creative autonomy, writing, directing, and often starring in his films while maintaining complete control over casting, editing, and final cut. This control extended to his relationship with critics and industry recognition. Just as he'd learned to avoid the psychological risks of live performance, he would later systematically avoid award ceremonies, premieres, and public acknowledgement of his success. The same patterns that drove him away from stand-up comedy would characterize his entire approach to filmmaking success. The Blue Angel trauma also established his lifelong preference for working with small crews, trusted collaborators, and familiar environments. His films would consistently feature the same cinematographers, editors, and production designers who understood his need for psychological safety and creative control. The intimate, protected environment he created for filmmaking was the opposite of the exposed, vulnerable experience that live performance had represented. Modern audiences might wonder what comedy we lost when Woody abandoned stand-up for filmmaking. His neurotic intellectual persona might have evolved into something unprecedented in live entertainment. But given his psychological makeup, sustained success in stand-up comedy was probably impossible regardless of that December night's specific outcome. The anxiety and self-doubt that made live performance unbearable were fundamental aspects of his personality, not temporary obstacles that could be overcome through practice or confidence building. Filmmaking provided the perfect medium for someone who needed complete control over artistic expression while remaining physically separated from audience reaction. The traumatic night that ended his comedy career became the foundational moment for one of cinema's most influential artists. The humiliation that convinced him he wasn't suitable for live entertainment transformed him into one of the most celebrated filmmakers in history. The psychological weakness that made him abandon stand-up comedy became the creative foundation for an unprecedented cinematic career that continues today. If this story gave you a new perspective, there's more coming. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next Untold moment.